Good afternoon, all. Since tomorrow is Chag, happy Thanksgiving, or Yom Hodot, or Yom Hodu. Those of you that understand Hebrew get how funny that is. Thanksgiving, Hodot, the Hodot, and Hodu happens to be turkey in Hebrew. I am recording this on Wednesday, but since this is asynchronous anyway, it shouldn't really matter to people, and you can access it wherever you want, whenever you want. So last night, I had the honor and the privilege of being part of a multi-faith Thanksgiving service that was held in our area at St. Paul Lutheran Church. And we were talking about families. So we're bringing together our families. We're bringing together Muslims and Christians and Jews and Buddhists and everybody else who would come to a multi-faith service. And yet at the same time, we're talking about Thanksgiving, and you look at all of the advertisements out there about the family coming together and all of this mental health writing about families being very nervous about coming together for this experience when they don't see each other all year and they don't get along, and fractured families and all of that. So we don't know much about fractured families, right? We just have our families of Parshat, which clearly creates all kinds of problems. And as family, we are taught, is our first and most foundational social unit where we learn our behaviors. One must wonder what we learn from the behaviors of those in Breshit, as we have discussed. So my title for this week is Having Favorite Children is a Horrible Idea. And I'm going to begin with the writing of a woman, Katie Bishop, who writes on Family Tree, which is a venue for sharing family stories and challenges. She writes as follows, quotes, Joanna knew that she had a favorite child from the moment her second child was born. The Kent, UK-based mum says that she loves both of her children, but her youngest child just gets her in a way that her firstborn did not. When Joanna's first baby was delivered, he was rushed away from her due to a health concern, and she couldn't see him for 24 hours. Missing this valuable bonding time was, she believes, the start of a long-lasting preference for her second son, whom she was able to spend time with immediately after he was born. To sum our relationships up, Joanna says, I have to make an appointment to speak to my eldest, whose full name is being withheld to protect her children. With my youngest, I could call him at 2:30 in the morning and he would drive miles to meet me. My youngest is the nicest guy on the planet. He's caring, generous, courteous, and friendly. He is the kind of person who would help anyone out. Though she battled her feelings for years, Joanna says that now she is in a place of acceptance. I could write a book on why I love one more than the other, she says. It has been hard, but I haven't any guilt about it. So last night, I shared from our Parshat, Toldot, two stories. The one about when Jacob and Esau are born, at which point we read that there is something going on in Rebecca. She's in distress. She comes, and of course then she's told that they are going to be very different. They're going to be different nations. The older is going to serve the younger. Then we're told not much about their childhood, but that the youth grow up, and Esau is a man who loves hunting, a man of the field, whereas Yaakov is an innocent man dwelling in the tents. And it then says in Breshit chapter 25, and Isaac loved Esau more because his game was in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we have this situation here. And in this situation, it is very real, it is very human, and we see, number one, differences in circumstances of birth. We saw that with Yishmael and Yitzchak as well. One gets the party, one doesn't. Cain and Hevel. 2, reactions of all involved to these different circumstances. 3, feeling connected to our children in different degrees and ways. And 4, managing our roles as parents and as a human being who is the parent. This can be observed in our Parsha when we look at the dynamics of Yitzchak and Esau and Rivka and Yaakov. We read, And God said, Shnei goyim b'bitnach. There are two nations in your belly, Ushnei lu'umim, and two peoples will come from with you. V'yetzeh harishon ad modni kulo kaderet se'ar v'yikra'u shmo Esav. And one comes out all hairy and red and rough and tough, and they call him Esav. And the second one comes out achuzat ekev Esav, on the heel of Esav, and they call him Yaakov, heel. Okay, think about that. So Rabbi Dan Moskowitz from Vancouver, Canada, explains as follows. In our Torah portion, the parents of twin boys, Yaakov and Esav, are not so careful or circumspect with regard to showing favoritism to one child over the other. From the outside, we are told that these two children are very different beings and that they will have very different relationships with their respective parents. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a 19th century German Orthodox rabbi, observes, the rabbinic commentators point to the phrase, when the boys grew up, in verse 27 to emphasize that while it was prophesied and known to Rivka that the boys would be quite different, she and Yitzhak nonetheless raised them in precisely the same environment and with the same methodology. This was their mistake. We know, and we're certainly learning in our world today, DEI, of diversity and embracing and inclusion and understanding that we have to educate people differently, that equity and equality are not the same. Giving our children the same thing at all times is not meeting their needs. The example is, think of this. You have a 2-year-old, you have an infant, and you have a 5-year-old. You have a cup of milk, you have a bottle of milk, and one gets nursed. It is clear which is appropriate for which one. And while they are different amounts and different methodologies, that's not equality, but that is equity, giving each what they need within their context and given their reality. Rebecca and Yitzhak did not discern that each child needed an upbringing that was curated for their special socio-economic, issues or needs. Even though children may come from the same parents and be the same age, born as twins, as in the case in this Parsha, no two children are the same, just as no two people are the same. Therefore, how we raise each one must be as different as they are from each other. As the mom of twins and watching my oldest daughter raise her twins, I live this and have lived this for many, many years. This acknowledgement and accepting of differences is not trying to obliterate the differences, as that will never work. Here is the tension. We will be different. We will feel drawn to some people more than others within our nuclear families, and within our friend circles, and within our synagogues, our shuls, our churches, our communities, whatever it is. But we must figure out how to negotiate these truths in a healthy and appropriate manner. A colleague and friend of mine, Rabbi Nachum Ansel, proposes the following. If Yitzhak and Rivka had acknowledged that their children needed different upbringings, perhaps a lot of the enmity that ensues would not have occurred. But then remember our discussion from last week. We are not perfect. We are not flawless. And we do not know how to deal with every single possibility that is placed in front of us. In fact, the very differences that attracted one child and one parent to each other could very well account for the conflict and the differences between them, instead of looking for causality. So now what do we do? How do the lessons of the parents influence and serve as markers for the children? We look at their interactions, we study their behavior patterns, and then we craft our own. We know this to be the case in, for example, continued generational trauma patterns that often mark our families. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, who I will be using a lot in the coming weeks in her book, The Beginning of Desire, looking at the stories and the families of Breshit, explains the family dynamic as one of separation trauma that is repeated again and again. Aviva writes, one might say that the difficulty in rearing children has to do with the ambiguities of independence. The child must separate from the parents, the parent must separate from the child and allow the child to discover their own reality. When there was one, there is now two. But this separation, though necessary, is a complex and often tormented experience. The relationship between separation and loving attachment must be negotiated each time afresh. There's no theory that can totally guide the parent. In the act of creation itself, there is perhaps this inevitable sadness in recognition of this truth. We all go back to Adam and Chava. So this separation trauma that occurs generation after generation after generation as parents are figuring out how to deal with their children, and then not both parents will deal with all children the same way. This is seen as generational, as universal, and it is most likely hardwired in us as well. Let us continue this notion of challenging relationships and healthy separations and figuring out our realities by looking at a troubling scenario that we know well from past discussion and Torah text. Going to chapter 26, verse 6. Yitzchak was in Gerar. And of course, we've seen this 2 times before. The man of the place asked about his wife, Yishalu Anshe HaMakom L'Ishto V'Yomer Achotihi, my sister. He learned this. This is a pattern that we've seen Abraham, his father, do twice. Why? And here it identifies, Ki yarei lemor ishti. He was afraid to say it's my wife because the men of the place would kill him and take Rebekah, Ki tovat marathi, because she was so beautiful. And it comes to pass, he's there, and Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, looks out the window, and he sees, and Yitzchak mitzachek at Rivka ishto. In other words, they're laughing, they're hanging out together. And Avimelech says to him, wait a minute, you're only behaving with someone like that because she's your wife. Why did you tell me she's my sister? And he says, because he was afraid. So of course we understand, how did he know to do this? Where have we seen this before? And parents, do we think that we hide our behaviors and our ruses and our fears from our children? Really? They don't know? Avimelech, of course, then says, what have you done to us? This was a ruse, and now we could have been hurt. And he responds, whoever touches this man or his wife, Hanogea be'ish hazel be'ishto mot imat, will surely be put to death. Is it possible that this third time we see not just fear, but established lines of fractured relationships that may very well have been fueled by the fear of personal well-being, here, in this instance, between wives and husbands? That is, a willingness to save one's life at the expense of another. Avram seemingly separated from his wife for his own sake, and perhaps now Yitzchak is doing the same. Was the child familiar with this shade of a fracture from his parents' experience? Did he hear them speaking, and they didn't think he heard? Do we dare think this way regarding our patriarchs and our matriarchs, our Avot and Imahot, and their families? Now, in this context, let's look at a text that we know very well. Chapter 36, verse 34. Esau is 40 years old. He marries Yehudit, the daughter of Be'eri the Hittite, and Basamat, the daughter of Elan the Hittite. So here we see Esau following his father's way. The child with whom the parent most identifies will be the child who most identifies with the parent, separating from the entirety of the family structure. Yitzchak was separated through the Akedah, and there was fracture in his family, and now there's fracture in this family. This hurt Yitzchak and Rebekah. So the parents now are being presented in the text, V'tiyena marat ruach liYitzchak u'lerivka, as a unified front in religious standards, but not so in the treatment of their children as we continue the Parsha. Who feels close to whom? Who does not? So it's just an interesting dynamic here that the parents are unified in their desire for the continuation of the legacy, but they're not because that's them. That's what they leave, the Yerusha. But when it comes to the individual children, we don't see that. So now we go to the later events in this parsha, and we understand the lines have been drawn, parents have chosen their favorites, and the children have responded in kind. And here we are. It comes to pass that when Yitzchak is old and his eyes are too dim to see, he calls Esau his elder son. Beni, he says. And Vayomer Hineni, he says, here I am. He says, now I've grown old. I don't know the day of my death. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around. Perhaps I will reach the age of my mother when she died, or my father, and that becomes the benchmark for how long the child of those parents will live. So he says to his son Esau, sharpen your implements, go out to the field and hunt game for me. Yitzchak is saying this, right? And make for me matamim kasher ahavti, tasty foods like I like. And I will eat them, and then I will bless you. So in the midst of this favorite son, favorite father pact, we have Rebekah and Yaakov. They overhear as well. Remember, walls do not always hold sound, right? And Rebekah says to Jacob, behold, I heard all this. Now you should go. I'm going to put hairy skins on you. I'm going to give you my recipe, and you're going to take it to your father, and he's going to eat it, and then he will bless you as he should. And Jacob tries to resist this. He says, for example, but Esav achi ish sa'ar va'ani ish chalak. He's very hairy, and I'm not God. God's going to know. And of course, his mother has this whole ruse, that plan, and so that should not happen. So here's a thought. It is clear that in these texts, the lines have been drawn. Could we be looking at, in some very strange way, a means of divinely planned reconciliation here? Not planned by the folks involved in the drama, but by God's oversight. I'll explain. When Yitzchak would taste Rivka's recipe, and then consider the taste of the food from Esau that he so loved and specifically requested, could he come to understand that in the end they were not as different as he thought and taught? In other words, we create these differences in our lives. And then we say, oh, you're my favorite person, or you're my favorite this, or whatever it is, or I don't like you because of these perceived differences. But somehow, while he preferred Esau's food, he's eating Rivka's food being given to him by Yaakov, and it has replaced Esau's recipe. So what's going on here? Did they read the same recipe books? In this fractured family with favorites, all have been damaged in spite of the fact that they may not be as different or as distinct as they thought. And we were talking about this last night at the interfaith service. In response to this text, my colleague, Reverend Barbara Ballinger, read the story of the prodigal son from the Christian scriptures, where again, you've got two children. One follows the rules and is very close to the father. One goes and does his own thing. And then the question is, which is the son that is excluded? Is it the good boy, or is it the one who needs different things? And is the lesson of the prodigal son that we do need to differentiate in our parenting and how we interact with each other and how we build bridges in our very fractured world? As I always say, we share a lot, and we should celebrate what we share. And we must respect and have regard for where we differ. We cannot brush them under the carpet. As an educator of all ages, but working in schools for over 40 years, you must respond to different needs of the students in front of you. As a colleague, You must interact and communicate with your colleagues, with your friends in ways that they understand. Remember, communications theory is not what I say. It's what the listener hears. Aviva Zornberg goes even further in terms of looking at this as how could these recipes not be so different that Yitzchak would have recognized it. She suggests that Yaakov becomes Esav. The Or HaChaim explains that when Yaakov bought Esav's birthright, he also bought and took on his characteristics. So that while the Midrash may want to talk about the softness of Yaakov, the obedience of Yaakov, the wildness of Esav, Aviva Zornberg and others suggest something very different. They suggest that each one influences the other, and we have begun to talk about this notion. And in doing so, each one becomes more like the other, which, by the way, is really interesting when you go to look at the dream sequence, and Esav is fighting with the angels, as we spoke. And some suggest it's his own conscience, it's Esau, it's this. You know this. Married couples who are together for many years, you take on characteristics. You begin to even look alike. People say that people look like their pets. Children who are told they look like their parents. It may be facial features, but just as often it's facial expressions that they've learned. So we become the other, and therefore the other is no longer such. The Sfat Emet supports this and says that Yaakov puts on Esau's clothes, and when he does that, he feels like Esau. This totally turns on its head the notion that when we educate, do we deal with our children in terms of respecting their differences, or do we want to obliterate them? The problem here is to obliterate the differences is not the point. The point is, rather, the focus is to see that maybe we're not as different as we think. And maybe this whole idea of favoritism is a myth, albeit one that creates a lot of problems. Our sages state in Masechet Shabbat 10a, one is not to favor one's child over one's other children. We see that Yaakov favored Yosef and fashioned for him a ketonet pasim, a beautifully colored coat, which incurred his brother's jealousy. This resulted in our forefathers' descent to the slavery of Egypt. However, hold that thought, because we're going to come back to it, and we're going to look at it from yet another direction. Again, God's orchestrating everything and the parts we play. So where are we left? Many psychologists and other experts in the field of child rearing caution against differentiation between children when it is clear that it will lead to strife in the family. Yet, we must balance between differentiation in treatment versus differentiation in meeting individuated needs of our children, as we discussed above. Equity is what is needed, and equality is not always equity. Unique bonds and special accommodations can yield wonderful results if initiated from honorable intentions. But to favor a child because they have something we lack, as may have been the case with Yitzchak and Esav, or because the relationship is easier, which may have been the case with Rivka and Yaakov, and to hold those loyalties above the integrity of the family unit, perhaps because of earlier fractures and trauma, such as the experience of Yitzchak and Rivka, all this will only contribute to generational patterns that will bring more fracture and trauma. When lines of distinction are drawn in our lives, we stop seeing ourselves as part of a collective, be it a family, a community, a people, a political party, and so on. Instead, we draw the lines of us and them, not to be reconciled, but to devolve into enmity. So here we're left with the question of how do we acknowledge our unique natures? How do we appreciate and learn from our differences when we decide this is our favorite one? This is the easier relationship, and we will not engage with others that make it difficult for us in the same way. This is not the way to build healthy relationships. Rather, we must remember that as parents, as children, as members of families, as friends, as communities, we are not all the same. We will have those we prefer, but we should not create lines of enmity with those for whom we should accept the challenge of working a little harder to understand what it is that they need, as Rav Hirsch explained earlier. If we are good people striving for shared goals of success and progress, then we pull together with our differences. We do not separate and choose our favorites because of them. Think of the wonderful things we can learn from those who are different than us. I wish you all a happy and meaningful Thanksgiving. And one of the things that I am so thankful for, because we do go around our table and say those things when we're all together, I have so much gratitude for all of those that I am privileged to work with, to learn from, as we bring our faiths, the texts of our faiths, and the foundational truths of our faiths together in our shared attempt to heal the fractured relationships that so hurt our world. Happy Thanksgiving and Shabbat Shalom.